Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode, we speak to Dayne Williams, an educational psychologist, about ADHD in adults. Dayne Williams, welcome to the show. We're really glad to have you on board today. So thanks very much for taking your time and giving us the opportunity to speak about this topic, because I think we've talked about it from a childhood point of view or pediatric point of view, but adult ADHD, I mean, that's interesting. So maybe just to kick it off, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you so interested in this special area of interest.
Well, firstly, thanks, Oliver. It's really great to be with you today. So yes, a little bit about myself. As you know, my name is Dayne Williams. I'm an educational psychologist, trained in the Cape Town region, and that's where my private practice is. And I have quite a wide scope of practice and various fields of interest, but ADHD has primarily been one of the focus areas for me. For a number of different reasons. I think there's a great need for better diagnosis in the healthcare industry. I feel like sometimes people can get diagnosed with a 10-minute conversation, and I don't agree with that. So that's quite a passion for me to make sure that we have definitive diagnoses. Executive functioning is another area that's closely linked to ADHD, and that was an area of interest to me. And then I think on a more personal note, ADHD is a journey that I personally know a lot about. I was also diagnosed in my 20s, and so it's been an area that I've just drawn on from a lot, and that's probably where the interest originated from.
That's actually amazing. So I like what you said about the early diagnosis one, and I've never heard it from an adult point of view. But I know we had one of the practitioners on, and she said, because I asked her a similar question, and she said, until the child can start speaking, we don't really, I don't really want to, do any type of diagnosis or, until I know for certain. So I really like that point that you just mentioned. But actually, that's so interesting that you say, you got diagnosed in your 20s. I mean, I would have never guessed that. I mean, when you just gave the brief for this show, I just thought, maybe it's it's almost like a referral from when the child, starts off, from childhood, and obviously between the practitioners, they move. But you say actually adults do get diagnosed into their adulthood. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for an older generation, there wasn't as much information on ADHD, even though it's been around for several decades now. Even Ritalin's been on the market for I think 50 odd years already, but it wasn't as prevalent in terms of testing, in terms of educational assessments at school, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about this, but a lot of the time when it's inattentive ADHD, it got passed off as, this child's just lazy, they just need to work harder, that kind of thing. And so when people aren't diagnosed and they eventually move into adulthood and ADHD doesn't miraculously disappear, then if they haven't had a diagnosis, then those symptoms are still going to be there, and they are still going to impact on their lives. So for some, ADHD was diagnosed in adolescence, and that's stayed there the entire way, and so they're aware of that. But myself, that wasn't the case, and my learning barriers or ADHD at school wasn't picked up on, and it was something that only really came to the fore in my 20s. And I think my story is actually quite common. There's a lot of adults that are increasingly reaching out for assessments to find out, hey, I think I've had this. I've kind of had an inkling my whole life I've had this, but I really want to know a little bit more.
So, Dayne, just based on that means that there really isn't much of a difference between childhood ADHD and adult ADHD. It's just more along the case that oftentimes the ADHD wasn't picked up when the person was in childhood or going through school, and it only, as they get older, start to go, okay, there's definitely something here that everybody missed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the only difference from a clinical perspective is that there's slightly less symptoms are required to be present in order to make a diagnosis. It's 5 instead of 6. I mean, that's literally the only difference in terms of the clinical perspective. But I think the main reason for that is because the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, was written, at least with ADHD, was written more with adolescents and children in mind. So I think that's the difference there. But I think from a lived experience, there can be very different manifestations of ADHD, even though the symptoms are at their core the same. The external factors are different. So, as an adult, you're going to have the pressure to succeed in a career one day, managing a romantic relationship or with a spouse or a significant other, even parenthood. I mean, these are all aspects, of course, that children don't deal with, but adults do. And your ADHD is going to have an impact on all of those different spheres. So clinically, not much difference, but of course, in manifestation, it has a big difference.
And I suppose the challenges, that's what you're speaking about as well. I mean, the challenges for an adult are way different. So, and it's interesting that you mentioned the corporate or the work scenarios, because there's lots of people that don't struggle, that struggle with that. And then they kind of, try to find another career or try to find another job, and there's kind of job hopping. But that's actually
exactly.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that. And you started with the R word, which is Chaz calls in Ritalin babies, but obviously now we're talking Ritalin adults. But is the medication the same though? Or as in just different dosages?
Yeah, absolutely. It is the same. Although, I mean, in terms of the actual, prescriptions are the same, but the dosages are different. So you won't find a lot of adults on short-acting Ritalin. But what I find, I mean, naturally as a psychologist, I'm not prescribing medication, but what I find in my patients to be quite effective is the long-acting Concerta as opposed to Ritalin. I find that they, and even as a bit of an outsider, but when we have comorbid symptoms and there's a lot of anxiety, it seems like Strattera might be quite a good option as well. Not quite on the same field as Concerta and Ritalin, but in terms of ADHD treatment, those seem to be the front line for adults.
That's interesting. My wife, and then now I'm not going to remember the term, but there was a ADHD conference recently, and I think it was over a few days. Yeah, and she was saying there was some medication coming out of England, and it was a little bit different. I can't remember the name now, though. But I've heard of obviously Ritalin, Concerta, Risperdal, and the one that you just mentioned now, which I'm not going to remember as well.
Strattera.
Yeah. And do you find that, I mean, people that present with ADHD, do they, from an anxiety point of view, is there another medication? So do you have to treat the both? Do you have to treat, similar to children, you have to treat for the anxiety and the ADHD?
Well, I that there lies a bit of a difficulty, because one needs to first figure out, is the anxiety caused by the ADHD, or was the anxiety there prior to the ADHD? I think often if we just treat the ADHD, then we do see natural, a natural reduction in anxiety. But I suppose it really depends. For the most part, I think the first form of treatment is simply to treat the ADHD and to and to monitor the anxiety levels. If that doesn't have an impact, then you would treat the anxiety as well. But I would say probably about 60% of my patients are on some form of SSRI in combination with Ritalin or Concerta.
That's actually interesting, and I think maybe we should have a disclaimer right at the beginning of the episodes, just to say this is not the gospel truth. It's more like it's what normally happens, and it's no specific cases. But that's what we do find, especially with kids. I mean, it's more anxiety and the ADHD normally gets treated.
Yeah.
But I think every case is different. I do want to ask though, so you mentioned some of the pressures, but are there specific triggers that kind of trigger someone to say, or put up their hand and say, I need to go, set up an appointment with someone that obviously understands this, like Dayne. But what would be the triggers, for someone reaching out or saying, actually, I do have a problem?
Sure. I think the issue with ADHD is that because because it is neurological in nature, it's not something that just pops into existence, right? So if you have it as an adult, you would have had it as a child, and I think then those triggers could be, for the most part, they're often related to executive functioning. Um, so just executive functioning essentially is a term that we use to describe mental skills that help us navigate through life. And I mean, I'm sure we'll touch on it a bit later, but things like organizing and planning are examples of executive functioning. And in individuals with ADHD, they often have a lot of executive functioning deficits. And so when let's take an adult who's working in a corporate environment. If you feel like you are unable to meet deadlines, even though you have every intention of doing that, but you land up procrastinating significantly and leaving it until the last minute all the time, then that anxiety builds up and that process repeats consistently. Or you feel like actually you're capable of so much more, but you're not being recognized for that because you just can't seem to actually work with some sense of efficiency. Or you're having meetings and you're staring at someone and trying to have a conversation, but you're not really taking in what people are saying because your mind is wandering everywhere else. These are all aspects that build up. And you can imagine if this is happening consistently, it's going to cause an increase in anxiety and frustration. And eventually, people don't realize, okay, well, a lot of adults don't realize that it might be their ADHD, but they tend to internalize these things. So there's something wrong with me, I'm just lazy, or I just don't get it, or I'm not intelligent enough, or I just can't listen to people. And then after doing that, you can have, an ADHD meltdown even. And those are the kinds of things that eventually would probably trigger someone to seek out help. Yeah.
So I've been in corporate for over 20 years and, I can't help but smile because I've never, from a management point of view or an HR point of view, ever heard someone tell me, I think this person is struggling because he has ADHD. I've heard burnout, I've heard stress, I've heard personal issues, but, to my knowledge, I've never heard ADHD. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, do you find, like with your corporate, I'm assuming you do have, clients in corporate, but do you find that there's, I want to say allowance or maybe leniency for something like that?
Well, I think there should be. Do I think that there actually is? I don't know. I think we're moving into a space now where ADHD is becoming far more less stigmatized, shall I say? And I think people are talking about it a lot more. And I think a lot more people are coming forward and getting diagnosed. And so that's becoming part of the narrative. So I'd like to think that we're moving in that direction, but I would imagine that it might take a while still before we really get there. I do think that, I think in a corporate environment, I think it's important for people to acknowledge these things. It's not just ADHD, but it's any mental health issues. But they're obviously going to have an effect on our performance. Sorry, I don't want to be sidetracked here, but when I think of ADHD, I often think that it is a wonderful, gift-filled, neurodivergent experience. Okay, I know that sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but there's a lot of gifts that come with ADHD. Wonderful out-the-box thinking. And I don't want to stereotype and put all ADHD people in the same box, but I do see a lot of that creative spirit coming out. And so there are a lot of benefits to hiring people with ADHD, but there are a lot of liabilities too. And I think it's important to be able to balance those two things.
No, Dayne, I actually love that you said that. One of the therapists we were speaking to about ADHD as well said, in her mind, she actually sometimes sees it as a superpower. Yeah. And that's the amazing thing. But with everything, there are those liabilities. And as an adult, there are a lot more stresses. There's a lot more pressures than there were as a child or a teenager. And you mentioned an ADHD meltdown, but what would that actually look like in an adult?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, just to put it into context of what that is, an ADHD meltdown when we have emotions and feelings that build up so extremely that there's this outpouring, or acting out in some way. But I think, with kids, it's very easy to see that kind of thing. It often sort of resembles a tantrum of some sort. But with adults, it can really manifest in different ways. But I've seen frustration, significant crying, anxiety, a real sense of hopelessness, even self-loathing can be a form of an ADHD meltdown, where you just feel like, oh, there's just so much wrong with me and I just actually just can't deal with life right now. And I think that often is what I see. Patients, I tend to kind of use the metaphor of the pressure cooker. I watch a lot of MasterChef. So, and I think living with the challenges of ADHD can be unrelenting. And if it's not managed well, then they're bound to build up over time and pour out. So it's just like a pressure cooker, the valve, that steam comes out the top. That's exactly what we're talking about here. And I think my last point is that I think meltdowns serve a function in that they are a form of release. If we work on our self-awareness, though, and we let off some of that pressure cooker steam gradually, then to get the intensity of it.
Okay, that's actually, well, I like the fact that you're a MasterChef fan, but that's a good way to explain it. Actually, we have a swimming coach for our kids, and she came 2 weeks ago and she got burnt with the pressure cooker. So yeah, that story is quite recent for me. So Dayne, the thing I want to say about the pressure cooker stuff, and also, what you mentioned about like maybe corporates using this as an opportunity, or people using it as an opportunity. My wife and I were talking about the whole Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. And it's almost like how you almost like need to understand how they, how the new generation works, and how you could harness that. And I almost think that there's opportunity here to maybe train corporates or train, people about how to work with different types of people. But I, and maybe I'm old school or traditional, but in corporate, I think you come there and you have to do a job, and that's what you do. And there's very little understanding for these superpowers that you might have that's going to turn on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Or turn off.
Yeah, my experience, especially with IT people, it's more like late afternoon. So even my my partner on the one business, I mean, if you speak to him anytime before like 10 o'clock in the morning, it's just terrible, because he only wakes up at like 9:30. So my experience with IT people, it's the other way. They actually hit their zone at about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and then can go on until like 12. But I can imagine for medication, that must be a challenge, because I don't know how you would, go off medication or take medication then. Because I'm assuming you want to take it as early as possible, even as adults.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it depends, but for the most part, I think that's the best bet. Have breakfast first, and then take your medication before work. Usually, it takes about half an hour to kick in, and then you're in your sweet spot. So get the bulk of your work done in the morning.
Yeah, I love what she has said about the superhero or the the special power. And have you found that because the one practitioner also mentioned that her sister is has ADHD, and through varsity she just flew through it. Once she figured out how to get into a zone. So I almost feel quite envious of that. But do you find that your clients actually, when they actually realize how to cope with it, that they actually see it like that, like a special skill that they have?
I hope so. I think that's something that I really try and push that narrative, because I think that's really important. So, I mean, even as far as the wording goes, we often call it it is called a neurological disorder, but I hate that term, and I never ever say that. I don't want to think of it as a disorder. It really is. It's a neurodivergent way of being, and I think that is important for self-esteem, for belief. It's important to have a different insight into it, and yes, it can be really difficult. But what I do find, and you were talking about university and how some people seem to fly through, and that's great. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the narrative for everyone. But what I do find is that individuals with ADHD can focus, but they focus on aspects that they really love. So we often informally refer to that as hyperfocus. And so if you can help someone with ADHD find out where their love is and where their passion is, oh man, you've got an employee that will, do wonders for you, because they really are able to lock in on that and they want to do it. And in fact, sometimes it's hard to pull them away from the job.
So you mentioned earlier about irritation. So I'm assuming that there's two different aspects. You're going to get the person who's hyper attentive to something, and then the person who's actually not, so irretentive, not actually paying attention because their mind's in 400 other places. Or is it the same thing, just depending on where you are in the day? You're either going to be hyper focused or irretentive.
Well, no, yeah, not quite. I think everybody with ADHD has the capacity to become hyper focused, but it really has less to do with the time of the day and more to do with where your interest lies. I'll give you an example. I've got a countless amount of adolescent patients who I work with ADHD who cannot sit still for 30 seconds, never mind 10 minutes. They cannot seem to lock on into anything the teachers are saying in a school environment, yet put them in front of an Xbox and they'll be there for 8 hours and they won't even blink an eyelid. They are able to focus on that. Or we take someone, an adult with a particular hobby or craft that they've mastered over the years that they absolutely love, whether it's listening to music or creating something with their hands. Again, I talk about that creativity because that comes out a lot. But when we talk about ADHD, there are essentially three types. We have inattentive ADHD, we have hyperactive or impulsive ADHD, and then we have a combination of the two. But irrespective of which type of ADHD you have, you certainly do have the capacity, as I say, to hyper focus on tasks that you really, really enjoy. It's actually the tasks that you find tedious and boring that is really difficult to lock onto. I mean, and let's be frank, everyone's going to have that struggle in life. That there's a certain sense of normality in that. But when we're talking about ADHD individuals, I mean, it really is quite an impossible task. So I think it takes it to another level.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, because that's pretty much life for everyone. I mean, you do have your zones and you do have your moods and you do have,
for sure,
sometimes you just don't want to do that part. I mean, and for me all the time it's like gardening. I just don't want to do that stuff. It's like, but I think so it's almost like you have to trick your mind to be, to focus on certain things. And I think and I think people with ADHD probably maybe struggle with that a little bit more. But one of the other things that was bugging me is, so what happens if you leave it uncontrolled? So, I mean, I think you're quite fortunate, and I think your clients are quite fortunate to have people like yourself, around that they can go and see. But someone that doesn't get diagnosed, or someone that doesn't recognize that, what do you see as the outcome, or how would they struggle with that stuff?
So, yeah, that's an interesting one. I think quite simply, the symptoms persist. So what I've noted is that some adults learn coping mechanisms on their own that help, mitigate the symptoms. I've had several parents that I've worked with who, have not been diagnosed, but they have somehow managed, as they've grown up, they realize, okay, these are my deficits, these are things that I'm really struggling with. And they've learned mechanisms by themselves that have helped them be able to get to where they are, whether it's in the corporate world or in terms of their own studies when they were back at university level. So that's great, but that's, again, not the story that everyone has. And so for some, they continue to struggle, and the cycle just repeats itself. Kind of like what we spoke about earlier, where, often one of the big issues is that the symptoms continue, but if you haven't been diagnosed or you haven't been treated, then you don't always know that it's ADHD that's causing these things. You just try and point, the finger at different, other different options, whether it's anxiety or whether it's just I'm not good enough or negative self, core beliefs about yourself. But unfortunately, if left untreated, the symptoms will certainly persist, and therefore so will the challenges.
And I think you see this especially with trauma-based patients. I mean, the human mind is quite cool and amazing, and so is the body. But you kind of find ways to deal with it. I like what you're saying, because I think that's what happens. You find ways of almost coping. And for the ones, I suppose we're talking about more the dire cases. The ones that don't, obviously figure that part out would be more the outliers. Obviously they would struggle in different other ways. With life, maybe. We can name all of the really bad ones. Maybe drug abuse or family
Absolutely.
issues and all of those things. Maybe it presents like that. But I like how you say. Those coping mechanisms, sometimes, people figure it out themselves. I've often heard as well, when people, especially with a job, it might be that, maybe this company is not quite right for me, or maybe this job is not quite right for me. Do you find those things kind of play out as well?
Yeah, again, I think it can be quite a challenge to figure out whether that is is that a product of ADHD, or is that simply because actually it doesn't really fit you? And so maybe you should be somewhere else. Or is it itchy feet that you just feel like you're not having boxes ticked, and there's a sense of irritation there and you want something new? I think that's an expression I've often heard in relation to ADHD, that people with ADHD are novelty seeking beings. And I think that also ties into addiction as well. It's that sense of wanting to always branch out and to try something new and to be entertained and excited, because the worst enemy of ADHD is boredom. So you want to try and avoid that at every cost possible. And unfortunately, it's not just boredom. Often it can just be discomfort. Any sort of negative feelings can be really difficult for ADHD individuals to emotionally regulate. And so they're constantly looking for some sort of dopamine kick. So whether that is changing jobs for a new environment with new people, or that is, doing recreational drug use. I mean, it can be a number of different things, but really it's all the same thing. It's grasping at something that's going to give you that sort of novelty effect.
I like this point as well. And tell me, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the dopamine hits, but I was going to say normal, but that's not right. I like what you said about neurodivergent and neurodiverse and neurotypical. And, so practitioners have been telling us, throughout the show, they hate those stereotypes, and, so do we. But, is it with everyone that dopamine hit is quite a big thing, or is it more prone to people with ADHD? Maybe that's the question I want to ask.
Well, I think every human being on the planet is sort of driven by need for dopamine and the reward circuit. But ultimately, from the research that I've read, there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that individuals with ADHD do have naturally lower dopamine states, and so that would suggest, although not definitively, but that would suggest that the likelihood is higher that they would be seeking out those dopamine in various ways, perhaps more aggressively than your neurotypical individuals.
Okay, that's actually, I'm glad I asked that question, because that actually, I did think about that for a bit. But so when we speak about this, and I want to say with entrepreneurs as well, and I struggled with this, and I don't think I've been diagnosed with ADHD, but you always look at like this idea, and then like 2 years later it's like the next idea. And I think once I realized you actually have to stick with an idea for a little bit, that's where the change happened. Because it's so easy, and I love the term. I actually wrote it down. Novelty-seeking beings. I can see many entrepreneurs in that kind of box. It's like that's why you try a new business. It's as soon as it gets difficult, and the operations is difficult, or team management is difficult, and it's like, okay, let's go for the next one. But I like that.
It's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. You know, a high proportion of prison inmates have ADHD, but yet a high proportion of entrepreneurs and highly successful businessmen have ADHD. It's just the two ends of the same extreme, the same spectrum.
Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, it's like with everything, right? I mean, you can, take a pen and it's like you can use this to write the best book, or you could take it and, do some damage to someone. But I suppose it's how you use that superpower is
Absolutely.
the interesting one. But
How you use a superpower, quite right.
When I think of like Richard Branson, I mean, I can't see him not having ADHD. I mean, like, as a person or an entrepreneur.
Elon Musk for sure.
Yeah, like how do you fit all of that into like 24 hours? He probably only sleeps like 2 hours maybe. But how do you do those types of companies in like a normal human day? I mean, it's almost impossible.
For sure.
There's the other theory there is that a lot of your really successful businessmen have psychopathic tendencies. So again, they're either going to be serial killers or they're going to be successful business people because the emotional side is just not there. So, but Dayne, coming back to needing the dopamine hits and that kind of thing, I would assume then that if the ADHD remains untreated, those symptoms could actually get worse. If you look at, I'll use the really stupid example of arson. It starts with playing with matches. Then you go from burning a shed to burning a house to burning a building because you're chasing that same high. And that dopamine high, at some point, you're going to have to, they're going to have to keep escalating to get that same kind of dopamine hit, aren't they?
I suppose in that sense, yes. I mean, that would be how the addiction cycle works. But if we're speaking strictly about ADHD symptoms, there's quite a lot of debate around whether actually it does degenerate over time and the symptoms get worse. And actually, the more widely accepted view is that they don't actually get worse. It's rather the environmental changes that occur as you age that change, and then that makes your symptoms appear worse. So, I mean, COVID is a blimmin' good case study to prove that point. I've seen so many individuals with ADHD over this time because the flexibility that, or rather not the flexibility, but the change in structure and routine, which is ADHD's friend. Routine and structure are really, really important. When that's fallen away because 1 minute we're at home, the next minute we have to come into the office, we don't know what's going on. We're waking up at 10 o'clock in the morning because our sleep pattern is messed up, and then we're waking up at 6:30, and that makes the ADHD symptoms so much worse. And so that's environmental changes rather than actually at a neurological level, any changes in the system there.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And, it's been something I've been thinking about since COVID, since the pandemic started. And this is almost like my own thing, but I almost see the wave coming, because people like, I know so many people that, when I worked with them, that they were like, for lack of a better term, I mean, more like politics, they would prefer to have a meeting, and discuss something over coffee rather than have a meeting, where they can actually see you face to face or stuff like that. And, there's so much of that stuff. And I can't imagine that just being swept under. And it's almost like, what COVID has made us do was you had to function in a different way. And I just kind of see how, it's interesting to see how that plays out. And we've always said, and I think from the start of the pandemic, I think psychologists like yourself would always be busy. And I foresee that for many, many years still to come, because I think people are struggling with that stuff. And I also think from a business point of view, I mean, I think, the business leaders or business managers or execs, I mean, I'm sure would be struggling as well in terms of how to manage people better. Because almost everything that you knew of how to manage people and how to create structure, that got replaced by, Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And, that's, there's some companies that say, video off, and some that say, you have to have your video on. And there's so many different, almost like paradigms in terms of how even structure. You mentioned that magic word. Structure works. But the word, I know Shaz asked another question in between, but what I was thinking about was the whole idea of tolerance. And I was thinking, like Richard Branson and Elon Musk. It's like, how tolerant do you think they must be around people in their own team? Because I'm thinking like Steve Jobs was renowned for being almost like intolerant about, the quality levels and stuff like that. Do you think that people with ADHD, are they much more tolerant of like other people in their vicinity? I know it's flipping the channels, because we always say, should we be more tolerant of ADHD people or people with ADHD? But do you find that maybe people who do hit their zone with ADHD, do you find that they a lot more tolerant or less tolerant?
I'll give you an answer, but I have to put a disclaimer there, because I think any answer that I give with that would be quite anecdotal, just in the sense that I can, from my own experience in private practice, what I've seen is that I seem to note quite a high level of frustration and tolerance in most of my ADHD patients. But I certainly think there are probably, many individuals with ADHD that have a lot of patience and are able to tolerate people around them very easily. But I think that, yes, I do see that. If there's personality, we are often commonly referred to personality clashes. But when we have that with individuals with ADHD, it can be quite quite intensified, so to speak. And I think there's certain aspects about having the condition that makes you enjoy a very specific kind of person in a very specific routine, in a very specific structure. And if you have outside influences that are very much alternative, it can be quite jarring and quite difficult to identify and resonate. But like I say, that's what I seem to be able to, that's what I seem to pick up in my patients. But whether that's the case, I would be quite surprised if it was. I'm sure there are many that are able to handle others.
Yeah, I suppose that goes without saying. You can't generalize, but I just think of like people like Richard Branson and Elon Musk, trying to find a team that obviously they did successfully, or they wouldn't be where they are, but trying to find a team that almost like runs on the same cycle as they do must be quite a challenge.
It must be, I'm sure.
Yeah, I had a manager with me years ago, and he was good, but he always said, I wish there was two versions of me. Like in a movie with Michael Keaton, Multiplicity. If you could almost like just duplicate yourself. Obviously he had there was a little bit of narcissism there as well, which goes without saying. But I just wonder with Elon Musk and those very, very high functioning, how they tolerate people around them that maybe not on the same level. And I think, with ADHD, what we spoke about is this superpower. And then once they hit their zone, how tolerant they would be then with people around them. But all good. Shaz, on your side, is there anything that we missed that we should have asked Dayne before we close it up? I love this conversation. And, when Shaz came to me with saying, we got someone actually that specializes in adult ADHD, I was like, there's no way. Because we got so many pediatrics, and it's almost like completes the story for me, which is amazing. So Shaz, on your side?
I think we've covered quite a broad spectrum on adult ADHD and the facts. I don't really have any other questions from my end. I think we have touched on them, but maybe there's something Dayne thinks that we should have maybe asked and didn't.
Something that just popped into my head now is actually what is the process of diagnosis? How do you actually go about diagnosing ADHD? Because like I said earlier, I think traditionally a lot of medical practitioners may just have a conversation and say, all right, well, you appear to meet all the tics, and okay, cool, fine, you have ADHD, and then that's it. So it almost comes across quite subjective in that sense, and that doesn't really necessarily sit well with everyone. You kind of want to feel some sense and I say some sense because we can never be 100% sure, but we want to have some sense of feeling comfortable that a diagnosis is, valid. So, for those that might be interested, when it comes to a diagnosis, at least, or an assessment, one of the things that we do is we have to set up a proper meeting where we can sit for at least an hour and we can have a conversation where we can find out about that patient's history. One of the things that we need to do is look at developmental history and look at medical history as well. ADHD is something that has to be present prior to the age of 12, so we want to know that there's been a history of it, and so that's important. But then what I think I've tried to do, and I think that there are several people that do this, but what is important is to have a combination of both qualitative and quantitative information. So the qualitative information comes from the conversation and the stories and hearing your symptoms and how it affects your life in every aspect, and listening about your family history and your developmental history, etc. But the quantitative comes in the form of an actual assessment. So I use the CARS assessment, which is quite a well-known ADHD for adults. It comes from the same group that did the Connors form, which is also widely used for adolescents. But this one's strictly for adults, and it gives us really nice quantitative information that gives us an idea as to the probability that this individual meets the criteria for ADHD and which specific areas. I like that because it also helps us form a nice treatment plan. If we know, okay, well, it's self-esteem is clearly one particular issue that's a struggle for you, or emotional regulation, or something along those lines. So once we've got all of that information, it gives us a more holistic idea of what that patient might be going from, and then we can make a diagnosis that's definitive and therefore have a good treatment plan and refer that person on to the appropriate practitioner who can then take the process further.
I think that's amazing. I mean, I'm glad that you actually thought of that, and maybe we should add it as a standard with practitioners as well, that we ask that. But just going on that same point then, so if someone decided actually they were listening to this, or they kind of stumbled onto you, finding your details somewhere, what could they expect from a therapeutic process then? So I'm assuming they set up an appointment with you, and then, do you do a intake? Like, would that 1 hour assessment be that? And then how would it look after that?
Yes, absolutely. So generally how it would work is we'd have an intake assessment for approximately an hour. Then we included in that would be the quantitative assessment. So that would happen in my office. And then we would have another feedback session post the assessment where I would go through the results. So I will print out the report. We'll have a look at what the different numbers are. We'll chat a little bit about what I picked up in the qualitative interview. And then we will either say, all right, well, you meet the criteria for this particular type of ADHD, or you don't meet the criteria for ADHD, but that doesn't negate the fact that you have symptoms in this area. So in that case, maybe we need to be looking at this particular area. But if you do have ADHD, then we have a conversation around treatment and medication. And you can imagine there's, when it comes to medication, it's polarized views as to whether some people are very much in favor of it, others aren't. So we can chat about that, whether we go a more homeopathic route or we go a more traditional medicine route, or at least mainstream medicine route, and then make, as I say, referrals to the appropriate practitioners to actually make those prescriptions.
Okay, that sounds detailed enough. I did have something else. I mean, before we close it off as well. So I'm a big fan of almost like that proactive approach, and I think so when you talk about these assessments as for adults, I just think I had to do an MBTI at one stage, and I think it's a 16 PF was another one, but you always do that more as if there's a promotion or there's a new job and stuff like that. I do want to ask, and we can even spin this into another episode if this makes sense or not, but do you see any value in almost like people being a lot more aware of that? Because what I do like about the assessments, it's almost like a very scientific approach to how you could almost like be better, from a career point of view or a business or even a life point of view. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, I do the MBTI with my patients as well, but really in a career capacity, so more for career counseling and that kind of thing. But yeah, I do. I guess for me, where for me the line sort of then becomes a bit blurred between life coaching and psychology, because now we start to move into a kind of direction like, all right, well, let's look at your personality types and let's see what we can do to try and improve your efficiency and perhaps work on certain domains of your life, and that's not the kind of approach that I take in therapy, where we're more working with, well, to some extent the past, and I am quite solution focused as well, but it's more emotional work that I do, whereas that I feel is almost it's a proactive approach, like you say, and there's certainly a place for it, but the lines just become a little bit blurred, I think. But like I say, I certainly do that for career counseling. I think it's important to have those quantitative assessments for that. But from an emotional therapeutic perspective, I don't do a lot of assessments. I don't.
Okay, that sounds really good. I mean, I didn't even think of that, but that in retrospect makes a lot of sense. That's probably the reason why it doesn't get done. I just thought of, it always seems to get done by someone requesting it, but I've never heard anyone put up their hand and say, I need to do this because obviously it can help me. I just thought there might be something there. But this was amazing. Thanks very much for agreeing to spend your time, speaking to us. And I think Shez, I'm sure, agrees. She's nodding her head. But we learned tons, like we always do with these episodes.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, if there's something else we can, spend some time talking about, I would love that. But I love that aspect of almost closing the loop, from childhood to, being an adult, which is the difficult part. But thanks very much, Dayne.
You're welcome.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.